Chapter 10 of the Harbor. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Tom Weiss. The Harbor by Ernest Poole. Chapter 10. But what a relief to see him go, to forget his loud disturbing Paris and again drink deep of mine, the city of great writers. I'll never really know them, I thought, until I can not only talk, but think and feel in their language. So I drudged for hours a day in my room. I inflicted my French on my chums at meals, on defenseless drivers of buses who could not rise and go away, and on the blessed damoiselle, who said, "Va donc, chouque-chatouer filia, manière d'apprendre le français." I was vaguely thrilled by this idea, the more because so far in my life I had had no experience of the kind. On the streets, in cabs, and in cafes I began watching women with different eyes, more eagerly selecting eyes that picked out of the throng the one her of the moment, so that for me she was quite alone. She was of many ages, rich and poor, now gorgeous and now simply dressed, now a ravishing creature that took your breath, and again just funny and very French, with a saucy way of wearing her clothes. Her fascinations were always new. I watched her twinkling earrings, her trick of using her lips when she smiled, her hands, her silk-clad ankles, her swelling young bust, the small coquettish hat she wore, her shoulders, their expressive shrugs, her quick vivacious movements, and I watched her eyes. Her eyes would meet mine now and then, often with only a challenging smile, but again in an intimate, dazzling way that gave me a deep, swift shock of delight and left me confused and excited. In a little while, I thought. I decided to wait till I knew more French. She'll be strange enough, God knows, I thought half apprehensively, even when I can talk her language. And with a feeling almost of relief I would plunge back into my work and forget her. For me she was only an incident in this teeming, radiant life. I must learn French. I strained my ears at lectures, at plays from the top gallery. I hired a tutor to hurry it on. Years later in New York I met a Russian revolutionist come to raise money for his cause. 3 weeks have I been in this country," he said in utter exasperation, "and not yet do I speak fluently the English." That was how I felt about French. What a delight to begin to feel easy, to catch the fine shadings, the music and color of words and of phrases. How much more pliant and smooth and brilliant than English, how remote from the harbor. I could study my models now, not only their construction, but their small character touches as well. De Maupassant was still first for me. So simple and sure, with so few strokes, but each stroke counting to the full. One suggestive sentence making you imagine the rest. Everything else in the world shut out. Your mind gripped suddenly and held, focused on this man and this woman who, a moment before, had been nothing to you, but were now more real than life itself. Especially this woman. What an absorbing creature he made her, and the big human ideas he injected into these petites histoires. I wrote short stories by the score. Each one had a perfectly huge idea, but each seemed worse than the one before. I took to myself the advice of Flaubert, and from a table before a café I would watch the people around me and jot down the minutest details. I filled whole pages with my strokes. But which to choose to make this person or this scene like no other in the world? There came the rub. How had de Maupassant done it? The answer came to me one night. Not only by watching people, he talked to them, lived with them, knew their lives. The very thing my music teacher had said about Beethoven. How uneasy I had been then, how absurdly young and priggish then in the gingerly way I had gone at the harbor. Thank heaven there was no harbor here. I could enter this life with a whole-hearted zest. I began with one of my roommates. He was to be an architect, a hard-working little chap. His days were filled with sharp suspense. The Beaux Arts entrance examinations were close ahead. If he did not pass, he told me, his parents in Ohio were too poor to give him another chance. "If I have to go back to Ohio now," he said in that soft, reflective voice of his, "I'll put up cowsheds, later on barns, and maybe when I'm 50, a moving picture theater. If I stay here and go back a beaux arts man, I can go to New York or Chicago and get right into the center of the big things being done." With a wet towel bound around his head, he used to sit at his work half the night. I watched the lines tighten about his thin lips and between his gray eyes, grew to know the long weariness in them over some problem, the sudden grim joy when the problem worked out. One day he came home early. "Queer," he said simply. "I can see one side of your face, one side of your body, one leg and one arm, but the other side doesn't seem to be there." I looked up at him a moment. "Let's go out for a walk," I suggested. We went for a stroll in the gardens, and here I was surprised and just a bit ashamed to find that while I had a real sympathy for him, I had just as real curiosity. For here was a living illustration of the horror of going blind. I could see his jaws set like a vise. I could hear his low voice talking steadily on as though to keep from thinking. What was he thinking? What was he feeling? We talked of the most commonplace things, but moment by moment, through his voice and his grip on my arm, those sudden waves now of sickening fear, now of keen suspense, now of angry groping around for a foothold, seemed pouring from him right into me, became part of me, while the other part of me stood off and listened. "By God, this is life," said one part of me. "No, it isn't, it's hell," growled the other part. "This thing has got to be settled." I took him to an oculist, and there I had another close view, this time of intense relief. "Blind? Why no, you're not going blind," said the oculist kindly. "All you need is—" I heard nothing more. I had never had any idea before of how swift and deep relief could be. On the street outside I heard it not only in his unsteady laugh, but in my own as well. We celebrated long that night, and very late he took me to his favorite place down on the lower quay of the river, where with the lights and sounds of the city far off, it felt like some old dungeon. But just over our heads hung the heavy black arch of a stone bridge, and looking up through this arch as a frame, we could see close above a gray, luminous mass rising and rising in great sweeping lines till it filled half the sky. Silent, tremendous Notre Dame. From down here the old edifice seemed alive, and though my friend talked little here, I felt him again coming into me. And this time it was his religion that came, his curious passion for building. When at last we went home, he could see my whole body, and I felt as though I had seen his whole soul. Then I carefully wrote this down on paper. I put in every touch that I could remember. I rewrote it to make it big, and I made it so big I spoiled it all. I tore this up and began again. For about 2 weeks I wrote nothing else, but at last I tore up everything. After all, he was a friend of mine. "But where's the harm," I argued, "so long as I always tear it up? This is real stuff. I'll get somewhere this way if I keep on." And I did keep on. Shamelessly I wormed my way into friends by the dozen. I found it such an absorbing pursuit I could hardly wait to finish up one before I went on to another. There were such a bewildering lot of them, now that I had pried open my eyes. Would-be painters, sculptors, poets, dramatists, novelists, rich and poor, tragic ones and comic ones, with the meanest, pettiest jealousies, the most bumptious self-conceits, the blindest worship of masters, the most profound humility, ambition so savage it made men inhuman. Many were starving themselves to death. There was a little Hungarian Jew, an ardent follower of Matisse. "Technique?" he cried. "It is nothing. To grip your soul in your two hands and press it on your canvas, that is art, that is Matisse." He took me night after night through old buildings up in Montparnasse, immense and dismal rookeries crowded with Poles, Bohemians, and God knows what other races, all feverish post-impressionists. Often we would find three together close around one candle, scowling and squinting at their easels, gaunt, silent, eager. Matisse! Matisse! Most of them, said my guide, are just mad. They cannot paint. All think they are going to do great things, but all they are going to do is to die. It was through this little Hungarian that I made my first study of female life. Why delay any longer? I had been in Paris over 6 months, and I had qualms almost of guilt at the thought of this chastity of mine. At first I said, "Art is a jealous mistress," and this did splendidly for a time. But then a stout German youth came along and laid it down as an absolute law that no writer could do a woman right until he had lived with a dozen. Hence that scented little cat with whom he had lived for the past year. She was the first of the dozen, eh? Damn the fellow, how much was there in it? De Maupassant certainly hadn't held off. In fact, there were few of my idols who had. Why not be brave and take the plunge? It need not be such a terrific plunge. No doubt if I went at it right, I could find a safe, easy kind of a her, friendly and confiding, a thoroughly good fellow with none of these wild ups and downs. The less temperament, the better. She must have a good quiet head on her shoulders. No doubt we would need it. And she must not be too young. Let her have had affairs enough to know that ours was only one more, and would probably be as brief as the rest. The briefer the better. So tamely I pictured my first love. And the gay old city of Paris smiled, and in that bantering way of hers she brought to me in a café one night a perfect young tigress of a girl, a lithe, dusky beauty with smoldering eyes, and said, "Without doubt this one is better for you. Regard what loveliness, what fire! Oh, my son, why not be brave?" I was not brave. I barely spoke, and my friend, the little Hungarian Jew, who had brought her to my table, was forced to do the talking. For she, too, was silent. But how different was her silence from the quiet I had pictured. Presently, however, I became a little easier, and by degrees we began to talk. She told me she was a painter. An Armenian by birth, she had run away from home at 18, and here for 2 years in Julien's she had tried to paint till she felt she'd go mad. She talked in abrupt, eager sentences, breaking off to watch people around us. How her big eyes fastened upon them! "To watch faces until you are sure, and then paint. There is nothing else in the world," she said. And I found this reassuring. After that I saw her many nights, and from time to time, breaking that silence of hers, she became so fiercely confiding, not only about her painting, but about what she called her innermost soul, that soon I could look my de Maupassant square in the face, man to man, for I was learning a lot about women. As yet we were friends and nothing more, but I could feel both of us changing fast. In a little while, I thought. But at last, one night she took me up to her room and showed me her paintings. They were bad. They were fearfully bad, and my face must have shown the impression they made. "You must consider them frightful!" she exclaimed. I stoutly denied it, but things only went from bad to worse. Here was that temperament I had dreaded. Now she was clutching both my arms. "Mon Dieu! Why not say it? Why can you not say it?" "No," I replied. "You have done some extremely powerful work." Anything to quiet her nerves. "Especially this one. Look, over here." And I pointed to one of her pictures. "I will show you how I shall look at it!" she cried in a perfect frenzy of tears. She snatched up a knife that lay on her table, a very old, curved Armenian knife, and went at the painting and slashed it to shreds, and then scattered the shreds all over the room. After watching this little festival, I thought to myself excitedly, I know enough about this girl. My retreat was so precipitate as to appear almost a flight. Yes, I said to myself outside, de Maupassant knew women, and he went insane at 45. And so my next case was a chap from Detroit, whose aim, he told me, was no less than to make himself, by the sheer force of my will, a perfect all-round modern man. It was over his case that I lost what was left of my sense of honor. For I not only wrote him down, I kept what I had written. 10 years from now, I said in excuse, I won't believe him unless he's on paper. But having kept this, I began keeping others, until my locked drawer was filled with the dreams and ambitions and even the loves of my confiding, innocent friends. At last I was a writer. What a relief when my mother wrote that my father had consented to a second year abroad for me. In my gratitude I even grew just a trifle homesick. Hadn't I better come home for the summer, I wrote her. No, she replied, we cannot afford it. I want you to keep right on with your work. I feel so sure you are working hard and will do things I shall be proud of. I was not only working, but living, feeling, listening hard under the stimulus day and night of the tense, rich life around me. About this time I made a friend of a gaunt, bearded Russian chap, whose dream for years had been, like mine, to become a writer of fiction. His god had been Turgenev. About a year ago, leaving his home, a little town near Moscow, with 40 rubles in his purse, he had set out on foot with a pack on his back to tramp the long and winding road that stretched away 2,000 miles to the distant city of Paris, the place where his idol had lived and studied and written for so many years. Through this young Russian pilgrim I came to know the books of some of his countrymen, and through him I caught glimpses down into the vast, mysterious soul of that people in the north. Through other chaps I met those days, other deep, tremendous vistas opened up as backgrounds for these Paris friends of mine. Half the night, in that café endeared to so many youths of all nations under its name of the Dirty Spoon, I heard talk about all things under the sun. Talk that was a merry war of words, ideas, and points of view as wide apart as that of a Jap and a German. For every land upon the earth had sent its army of ideas, and they all charged together here, and the walls of the Dirty Spoon resounded with the battle, with roars of laughter and applause. For we were of free, tolerant minds. We were gay young dogs of war who had left our tails behind us, our tails of prejudice, distrust, and our emancipated souls had only scorn for hatreds born of race or creed. Like J.K., we had rid ourselves of all creeds past and present. But J.K. had always been free with a scowl, his feet set grimly on the ground. We were here free with a verve and a dash that took us careening up into the stars to laugh at the very heavens. There was breadth in our very manner of speech, for here were we from all over the earth, all speaking one tongue, the language in which half the things that had moved the world had been said by men before us. And what sparkling things there were still to be said! What dazzling things we would see and do in this prodigious onward march of the armies of peace, out of all dark ages into a glad, new world for men, where our great smiling goddess of all the arts would reign supreme, where we would dream mighty visions of life, and all these visions would come true. So we saw the world those days in the radiant city on the Seine. And meanwhile, far up in the north, the Russian Czar, having started with loud ostentation the movement for a worldwide peace, was swiftly completing his preparations to strike with his armies at Japan. With the other nations of Europe, jealous and suspicious of each other's every secret plan, they too were making ready for what the future years might bring. Young men are lucky. They will see great things. And these young men have seen great things, but they have not been lucky. End of chapter 10. Recording by Tom Weiss.